for someone building worlds like myself, there's a tension between game and real world that is interesting to explore. The real world is fairly boring in some ways and not and difficult, and there's a lot of friction. Games in particular often feel somewhat frictionless.
Buckle up, because I sit down with Watt, the maker of Cloud Empress, and we cover a lot of topics. We discuss their history of going to school for movie making and how that impacted how they make games. We talk about their focus and how it drifted from board games to role-playing games, and have a great discussion on NPCs and how to express their motivations. We get into a great discussion about GMs as players, and can a mystery game also be a mystery for the GM? We then spend the second half talking about Cloud Empress. It's a groundbreaking supplement for Mothership. Hold on to your wallet. This is a good one. Okay, sit back, relax, and enjoy my time with Watt.
Okay, do you want to search for any traps? Go ahead and roll. Oh, no successes. Yeah, you don't find any traps.
Hi, I'm Joe.
And I'm Roman.
And I'm Václav.
And I'm the Nick Westbrook.
And we are the cast of Umbral Means in the Dark,
An action-packed actual play of John Harper's Blades in the Dark RPG.
Check us out on the Third Floor Wars YouTube channel.
Don't go now. Wait until after you enjoy this episode of Tabletop Talk.
Howdy friends, Craig here. Today I'm talking with Watt of Worlds by Watt. They are a queer tabletop RPG designer and creator. Their game falls where science fiction, gender, humor, body horror, and climate justice intersect. Today we'll learn more about their recent RPG offering, Cloud Empress. It's an expansive Nausicaa-inspired fantasy setting for Mothership, the sci-fi horror game that you know I love. It is live on Kickstarter right now between January 17th and February 9th. So if you're watching this a little bit late, it is going to go to retail. So make sure you check it out. We'll have links to where you can get it in retail below. But after that long intro, welcome to the third floor.
Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be talking today.
So you have to be subjected to the question, I'm sure, in your little press tour here that you've gotten 8 million times, which is, how you found tabletop gaming. But the way I like to phrase it is there was a day where you knew nothing about throwing dice and character sheets and, sitting around a table with friends. And then it was put in front of you for the first time. So can we go back there?
Sure. My background is more in the tabletop board game, card game space.
Oh, okay. Well, let's start there then. When did you first discover those?
I'm not probably Pokemon, the Pokemon card game. And as was probably many people's experience, I didn't know how to play it. Many people don't. But I was in elementary school when Pokemon, the first games came out and the cards came out. And it's been interesting to see that nostalgia revival and the prices rise around our pandemic nostalgia. But started with Pokemon, collecting that, and then realized, there's this whole other game with much better artwork, in my opinion, called Magic the Gathering, at least at that period. Although I have gone back and looked at some of the Pokemon cards that are claymation and wool, and there's all sorts of neat stuff actually with the Pokemon art. So I probably shouldn't even said that. But got into Magic the Gathering again, not really learning how to play, but just sort of collecting the biggest creatures that I could find and the coolest artwork, which was really impactful. Did that a while, got into Mage Knight and different collectibles along the way. Played a lot of board games in particular. So the board game industry and my exposure to it was pretty limited, but a lot of Risk. And I think it was Risk 2210 by Rob Davio, who has since gone on to really do quite a bit in the board game industry, but played board games. And then at some point stumbled on Dungeons and Dragons 3.5.
Nice.
And I got the books maybe at a garage sale or at a used bookstore or on eBay. I think it was eBay for maybe $2 each. And I had a couple of the different books, and I just love looking through them and exploring the world of Dungeons and Dragons. And they had really evocative, what almost seemed like in-world covers that you might pick up inside the world of Dungeons and Dragons. And so I looked through those quite a bit, but there was something missing for me where I just couldn't imagine myself playing it. I
Why is
couldn't
that?
imagine. I could imagine myself playing it, but I couldn't figure out how to get from the book to the table, and
Right.
so it sat on my shelf for quite some time. In college, the Magic stuff increased, but also I had some more exposure to role-playing games, and some of my friends had started to play, and so we started short Pathfinder exploration of the Pathfinder RPG and played that for several sessions, and then it kind of lied dormant for, I don't know, maybe the next 10 or so years, and got into designer board games, Euro games, the Ameritrash or Amerithrash games, and became really active in this board game community. Actually did a bit of board game design. That was like a real goal of mine, to become a board game designer, and had a board game under contract for several years. And the game that I was working on was this sort of expansive legacy style where each session changed the world of the game that you would play to the next. And it was sort of, it had this large story component to it. So it was maybe 40 to 50,000 written words when I left it. So it had this huge storybook, and it was just too much for one person to take on. And I wasn't necessarily I didn't have a strong developer with me on the project. And it was sometimes your first project, maybe this is true in RPGs as well, but especially in board games, a lot of designers' first projects is their darling, the thing that they've been thinking about for years, and they bring to it, and it's just such a large project that, at least for me, I wasn't able to complete it, and so I sort of looked and got to a place where the contract was ending, and I didn't want to renew it, and I said, well, what did I like about this? What do I think I'm good about this? And I had been watching Questing Beast with Ben Milton for a while, just as an idea generation place. I had also seen Maze of the Blue Medusa by, I believe, I think Ken Bauman published it, who was a poet. I did some poetry stuff. And so I was familiar with that and started to get into OSR over the last, 10, 15 years, just looking at the ideas of the OSR really interestingly. And how wild and weird they were. But I realized, I'm really excited about making worlds and creating stories. And that's really what a lot of the players of the in development copies of this game I was working on, they were saying, oh my gosh, I want to know what happens to these characters. I want to play more in this world. And I realized, I can do that much easier than I can do the mechanical side of a board game. And so why don't we look at a tabletop role-playing game as a space to explore that creativity.
So let's go back a little bit. You're playing board games and you're enjoying those, and somehow you get the idea, I want to make games, and I want to try to understand that a little bit better, right? Because there's a lot of people that play board games. I am one of them, and I definitely get into some of the nuts and bolts of it, right? So there's mechanics that I enjoy. I have had enough exposure to game design to be able to recognize things that are super clever and things like that. But I've never had the desire to make a game. So what's different about you than me? Why did you get that itch?
I am a person that's really interested in making things, I would say. When I was a kid, my dream was to make a video game. I really wanted to design video games, but especially at that time period, the gap between what I could do at my house as a child and making a computer graphic video game. I was always interested in like 3D and the Transformers Beast Wars series. So I wanted to make like a Beast Wars video game. And I had friends, and we would talk about the video. We'd pick all the characters we were going to put in, and we never got to the design part, but we would come up with these ideas. And so that interest actually took me into a path of filmmaking. And so I said, well, I can't make an interactive game experience. I can make a movie of the idea that I have. And so I started making films with my parents' help, even in elementary school. And that developed into some work in public access TV in middle school, and then eventually went to film school for my undergraduate and explored filmmaking both from a writing lens as well as the technical aspects and the technology of that. So I think I have something in me that really self-expression through creating things that reflect my perspective or ideas. It's something pretty integral to me, and something I've not really had periods. I'm always looking for an avenue to express that.
Well, and based on what you're saying, both your first board game design, your move into TTRPGs, making movies, and even when you're discussing it with your friends about the video game, it seems to be a desire to tell stories as much as anything, right? Am I capturing that? Because even your board game was sounded very story driven, or is it a universe, or is that one and the same for you?
That's interesting. I'm not sure. I think both are pretty interesting to me. One of the things I have learned is to really recognize and honor the unique aspects of a media I'm working in. I don't know if you're familiar, or folks listening are familiar with, I think it's called Quantic Dream. I'm going to look it up real quick, but they do a series of video games, Quantic Dream, I'm sorry. So they do a series of video games that are really narrative rich. They did a game called Heavy Rain. They've done a couple other games, but they offer an almost movie-like experience in a video game. And their director or head of the company was really vocal around saying, this is the future of video games. It's to make video games more like movies is sort of how I interpreted it. And I really thought, he's right. And so I'm going to bring that same attitude towards board games. And so a lot of the work I did around this one particular board game was, how can I make a board game feel like a movie or feel like a cinematic experience? I think that's certainly interesting. And some people can do that successfully. But where I'm at now is that each media provides its own affordances, its own unique play experiences. And that's where I want to focus. And so to get back to your question around, is it story, is it world? Coming into role-playing games, I really did think about the game master and the warden as, how am I going to tell this story to my players? And as maybe other wardens and game masters have learned, emergent play and giving players freedom to express themselves and explore a landscape is something I've really grown to cherish and value much more than having a particular story that I can impart, or a certain message that I want to share with players, and really let that be more of an exploration. I think I have wanted to tell stories. I think I have also wanted to make worlds. And I remember standing on the playground in the snow and at the time pretending I was Thanos. I was really into Thanos as a kid. I think I was bullied a lot as a kid. And so I think there were some like sick power fantasies about Thanos and all his rings and all his power. And so I would stand on snow piles and imagine being on a great ship or being Thanos. And so I think the world was a big piece of that early exploration and that rich imagination I think I've had throughout my life.
So something that's interesting to me is, a lot of times when we talk about TTRPGs, we talk about, story driven, we're going to tell a story, it's a story. Mm-hmm. But when you're creating for this, you almost, or at least let me preface this, the writing and content that I enjoy the most is not when they're forcing me to tell their story. And it's something that I think that the Mothership developing community has embraced, right? I mean, you go through and look at the third party content or the stuff that Sean's made even, and it is like, look, this is what's here. This is everything that's happening. Go. As opposed to say like a Pathfinder, type, series of modules that are episodic and they're, this is plot point. So for you as somebody who wanted to direct, who, had a voice, what is it that makes that work for you? Because you're to a certain degree, you're giving up the story, right, to the table. Does that make sense?
Sure. It's easy and enticing to want to make especially nowadays, role-playing sessions into a Marvel movie,
Right.
where each character gets their big moment and the villain is going to take over the world. And it's the most natural thing in the world to take the things we love and want to replicate them across various forms of media. And I think the other piece, one of the big reasons I did not engage in tabletop role-playing games until really at the start of the pandemic again, was because I had so much anxiety about group facilitation, essentially. And one of the reasons I was more comfortable coming back was I had done a lot of group facilitation in my professional life, and so felt more comfortable to facilitate groups. But there is some level of comfort in having a predetermined path. What if the players do this? What if the players do that? Well, they can't. The castle door's locked. They can't. Sorry, your sword breaks. You can't do that. And that goes back to that unique affordances. I'm not very well versed in the history of tabletop role-playing games, but it's interesting, this interplay that I've noticed from my small knowledge of tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons and others influencing video game development, but then video game development, I think, influencing both role-playing game players and also the game design. And I think the player piece is something I've been talking a lot about with some other creators, in that players start to lose their imagination for options if they're someone really steeped in the role-playing game, video game space.
How so? That's interesting.
Well, I think sometimes players approach situations from a very hero-centric framework that is very popular in role-playing games. So it's not uncommon for two groups of people. You have the elves and the humans, and they're in a conflict. And you know what? You're the hero, and you come in and you're going to settle this trade dispute. You're going to settle this war, and you pick which side wins. That is not unique to any one media, but it is something that can become a cliche and really doesn't, in my mind, reflect real world conflict. I think the other piece is how the world might be set up around or for the players. So in many cases, video games are really oriented towards the player as the central figure. And in some cases, the world acting as a museum waiting for the player to engage with. So I think that can be a space where folks assume that everything's there for them, or they assume that each room is going to be a puzzle or a challenge or something really interesting. And I think one of the things I'm trying to do in Cloud Empress is not make everything so interesting. That's not a great pitch for the game, but
I think I know what you're saying.
If everything's special, if everything's a puzzle, if everything's intentional, then in some ways each element loses its shine, because there are different types of play, though. One of my recent reflections is how much dungeons have some similarities with escape rooms. And that's sort of that other place. In an escape room, from my study of them, and I've never done one, so maybe I'm not the expert there, but a lot of stuff in that escape room is specifically intended for you to determine what to do with or to solve the puzzle. And so what kind of boring experiences, what kind of real world, I guess there is a tension between, for someone building worlds like myself, there's a tension between game and real world that is interesting to explore. The real world is fairly boring in some ways, and not and difficult, and there's a lot of friction. Games in particular often feel somewhat frictionless.
Interesting.
Maybe that's not entirely true, but the things that we can do, how we move through the world, certain role-playing games
catered to, right? It feels catered, right? Like
maybe that's a better way to put it.
Yeah, I know exactly where you're headed.
You can. One example I've been thinking about with Cloud Empress, I had heard Shut Up and Sit Down, a really popular board game show and podcast.
Phenomenal. Everything they put out is great.
And they're great to watch. And there's this absurdist humor that's really fantastic. But Quinn's on that show in an RPG episode really advocated for making NPCs like pro wrestlers. And his argument was, have them immediately tell you what their want is. I want to go over here and unlock this chest, or I need to get out of this castle. And that's the way to best engage with his players, at least. I'm not sure if that was sort of I can't remember if it was just a suggestion for how he plays or just for new game masters. But that does create an environment that feels like a game, because people don't talk like that. People don't immediately tell you what they want. So as a game designer, how do I feel if, and I'm starting to explore this more, if a character does not clearly express their wants, or they're unwilling to give you their wants, maybe entirely, or maybe they require some level of trust, or some certain conversation triggers. And also for the player running the game, what if I don't tell them explicitly what that character's wants are? So what if I give the reader of the game some writing that's evocative, that creates questions, that creates feelings, but doesn't spell out, I have a character, Onion. Onion wants to this. Onion will do this to get this. Onion offers this. And that's how I started writing Cloud Empress. And it's really morphed into something that is, I think, less, I mean, it's still a game, but less game-like, less caricaturish. But that does have its consequences and drawbacks in that certain groups of players might really not hit a lot of story points, or they might skim off of characters, or they might not investigate further.
Right.
And it certainly takes more work, I think, for everyone involved to play a more nuanced NPC, which is not always welcome. and what stories are you interested in exploring? What questions are you interested in exploring as well? I think that's another, what moods are you trying to create? I mean, there's not one game experience that people want.
Thinking about, you consuming all these different type of media and starting to really work through this question in your mind that we just got done describing. Is there something that you came across that initiated that thought process? Was there something that you read and you went, oh, that's different, and it started the wheels turning?
Yes, that would be for me the writing of Luke Gearing, who you may be familiar with, who wrote A Pound of Flesh, Gradient Descent, but specifically a recent book called The Isle that Luke wrote. And Luke is actually a writing mentor on the Cloud Empress project. So Luke does a quarterly or half a year writing sort of internship program. I mean, it's not an internship, but a writing mentorship program where Luke selects one writer who applies and then works with them on a specific project. And so for the last 4 or 5 months, Luke and I have been working on Cloud Empress, and that's looked at, that's been a combination of looking at existing RPG materials that Luke felt like would ask interesting questions about some of the ideas that I wanted to explore, and then some discussion on, we talked about hex crawls, for example. So let's talk about hex crawls, or let's talk about writing NPCs. And so we'll have conversations like that. And then also some suggestive, supportive critique of some of the work I'm doing. So that's been a really valuable experience. And Luke's, so back to The Isle though. The Isle is interesting to me because I started seeing people say, I encourage you as the game master to not read this before you play it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Read it with your players. And I said, that's really strange. I've never heard anyone say something like that. People saying, and this is probably a whole conversation, but people would say, oh my gosh, reading The Isle is as good as reading a novel. So I said, interesting. And so I've read it. I have it on my shelf. And my experience was that reading it felt very enjoyable, just as enjoyable as I imagine maybe playing it. Maybe I'd have more fun playing it. But
why though?
Well, The reason I think, and something Luke talks about it, is that there's this idea of pre-chewing the reader's food for them.
Okay.
And one of my biggest inspirations in my own game design is Elden Ring, Dark Souls, some of the From Software games. One of the things you'll notice about those games is that rich online community surrounding them for a couple of reasons. First, it's the difficulty of the actual button entries, maybe, and the builds piece. But there's also a really rich community around the lore, because it does not explain very much very clearly.
Mm-hmm.
All of the lore in the world is based on environmental design and item descriptions, and then usually a 2 to 3 minute lore dump in the beginning. There was the Age of Fire, or there was the Age of Darkness, and then the Age of Fire came, and Lord Gwyn battled the dragons. And it's really probably 3 to 5 sentences stretched over 3 to 5 minutes. But what that does is it creates vibrant questions and hints at deeper mysteries. I find that the world is a pretty complex and almost unknowable place. I know that maybe is too big of a generality, but one of the things that I explore in Cloud Empress is cicadas. Cicadas are really weird.
They're really weird.
They're really weird. They go underground for anywhere from 9 to 13 years and live in a sort of semi-dormant state, and then arise in these great numbers and reproduce. Scientists aren't exactly sure why they do that. They are sort of, I think they're quite an old species. Cicadas are found across the world. So there's just really interesting stuff about cicadas. So there is no clear explanation for cicadas.
Right.
They don't have a single purpose. We don't fully understand them. And I think that's an idea that some of the best science fiction and fantasy touches on. The impression of mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly J.J. Abrams has made a career out of the mystery box, right? Present a mystery that is really enticing, and people go nuts for it. They love that stuff.
They fill in the gaps, right? They're engaged by that gap.
But most RPGs, many RPGs are written in such a way that the mystery is only given to the player. So you're about to go into a cave, and the cave is run by goblins who are worshiping a witch, and the witch is turning the goblins into pigs, and the pigs turn back into goblins when you can't see them. That'll be in the first sentence of the book itself. So all of a sudden, I think as a game master, someone reading this book, the game is not for me anymore in some ways.
Interesting.
It is for my players. So now I am going to be the vessel for the mystery, and I don't get to have an opinion on it. I get to present the author's opinion or the author's secrets, but I don't have any of my own secrets. I don't get to make any of my own decisions. That's a generalization and an oversimplification, but it's the same with NPCs. This NPC wants to kill this person because they betrayed them. And they betrayed them for this reason, and if they get this gem back, they won't be mad. Okay, well, certainly that helps. Reading something quickly helps me understand it. But one of the other things Luke and I talk about, and this is more Luke's comment than mine, is that something hard-earned is less easily forgotten.
Mm.
So if I have to do the work of uncovering a mystery or making my own opinions about a world or deciphering between two competing opinions from a Dark Souls community about the whether a god's alive or not, I remember that. So all this is to say, Cloud Empress is designed to be some level of work for the person reading it, but in the way that not replicating a novel exactly, but someone like Gene Wolfe or Ursula Le Guin, they could write things more clearly than they do.
Right.
At least from a plot and descriptive place. But what they do is they evoke the feelings and a sensory experience that's different than simply experiencing the world as if looking at a picture or something. There are authors, I think, more like Brandon Sanderson that do some really great plot work. But Brandon, I think in particular, has said, I don't write like them because their writing is like a stained glass window. I'm trying to make a clear window. So Cloud Empress in some ways, and some of my more recent writing is more akin to a stained glass window.
Interesting.
Where the reader may not get the clearest answer, but I think that they'll have a tonal impression, a thematic impression, an emotional resonance that will enable them to make their own decisions around that. And that's scary. But I think the other piece in my own personal word style that I'm going to try to add to the book is really asking the players questions and changing the relationship, which is not new. Many games have done this, but I tend to ask my players a lot of questions. Does that sound fair? What do you think their response is? Those types of things, so that I'm not solely responsible for determining everything in the game.
And getting into the history of the hobby, that's relatively new. And, you know, I played back in the old days where the, you know, DM GM was the god, right? Wrote all the code. And you were going to come to my table and you were going to experience my story. And that was the expectation. And that changed over the last 20 years. Yeah. And what's
your reflection on that? I mean, I'm sure you had probably positive experiences in that older setting, or is there any loss you feel around that?
This is a real complicated answer. You ready for this? So there was something very egocentric and enjoyable about the old style, right? But there was also it also created an incredible hurdle because all responsibilities all gravity was around one part of the table. And, you know, it even ties into what you were talking about, you know, the railroading removal of agencies saying, no, your sword broke. You can't attack them. You know, and when I first started stepping across the chasm into something else was when I first encountered Blades in the Dark, because something that John does there is he says, yeah, the sun blew up. That's it. And there's ghosts. That's it. And there's whale blood, and whale blood powers these things. That's it. And my first reaction to that, well, why did the sun blow up? Well, how does that power that? Why is Leviathan blood, dude? And I was like, no, I need more. I'm not ready. And then I like took a breath and I said, well, let's find out together. Right. And then suddenly bringing games like Blades in the Dark, and there's many other games to your point that are like this now, it allowed me to experience the world with the players and to find the answers to these things, not point them towards the answers. Let's discover it. Another game where we're doing that right now on the channel is our Forbidden Lands games. I think Free League and Eric, especially with the way he designed Forbidden Lands, does a really good job of just going, here's your playground. We're going to give you some, you know, some ideas. But they're not really story driven. We're just going to tell you what's happening. And then we're going to drop the agents of chaos, which is you and your players, into this. And let's see what the hell happens. And, you know, we're 20 plus sessions into this Forbidden Lands games, Watt, and I am discovering things about the world. And that's awesome. As the person who's running it. And it's very exciting. But it removes a considerable amount of burden, right? So it's a little bit more of a shared responsibility at the table. You have to have the right table because, to your point, there are some players that do not want to do that, right? There's some players that love it when you say, what's the bartender's name? There's players that love that. There's other players that are like, no, that's not why I'm here. You tell me who the bartender's name is, right? And there's no right or wrong there. It's just, you know, style of play. And that's a very superficial version of what we're really talking about, right? And I'm very interested to learn more, and I've got to get him on the show about these conversations you're having, because I am a noob to it in that respect. It's something that's new to me in these last 2 years, and I definitely jam on it. I definitely enjoy it, but I'm also blessed to have an incredible pool of players that play with me. I think that it's very possible my opinion about this would be different if I'd had some bad experiences around it.
Sure.
Does that answer your question?
I think so. I think, like you said, thinking about the table and the play group is really important. I used to play Pathfinder with a group that was full of power gamers, and it was really an adversarial relationship, it felt like, in terms of how easily can you kill the stuff I'm going to throw at you, and how are you going to figure out this class system so that you're going to do way more damage than I anticipated you doing, and that kind of thing. You figured out how to get this armor that I don't think you should have, so I'm going to maroon you and you're going to drown if you don't toss the armor off, that kind of thing. And that's just, as someone that's a bit older now and doesn't take as for granted how special it is to be at a table with some other folks that I care about. Grounding play in, hey, we're all here to, why are we all here? I think we're all here because we want to create stories together that have these certain moments, and talking about that with the players as sort of a session zero. What do you like in your games? What do you not like? There are, I think Mothership in particular has a subset or section of it that really is around puzzle solving and getting through the warden's puzzles, horrible puzzles. Cloud Empress isn't as puzzle based and challenge based, I would say. It presents difficult situations, but I think my general framework is, how would my character solve this problem?
Yeah,
and I see a lot of Mothership players in particular, for one reason or another, maybe OSR players in general, that I shouldn't generalize too much of anything, but there is something appealing about that escape room of, how would I solve this? How would I get through this situation? What's the smartest way to do it? And that's cool. And that's really fun. But the default for a lot of Cloud Empress games is, well, you're not here.
Right.
Your character is. And so what does that mean? Who are you playing? What experiences are they having? What are they bringing?
What are they good at?
Certainly other games do this, but that's sort of another sort of take on Mothership I'm making is really centering it around the characters in the space.
So I want to call back to something that you mentioned that I want to explore just a little bit more. And then I also want to talk about Mothership with you. But first, you mentioned some anxiety around, running a game, right? When you first ran up to it, but professionally you were put in a situation and it sounds like had experience or even training around facilitating.
Yes.
And I'd be curious, what did you learn there that you were then able to bring back to the table? So a completely different world, completely different structure. You picked up ideas, thoughts, skills that made you say, you know what, I think I can apply this with a bunch of my friends at the table. And I'd be really curious, what was it that gave you that confidence? What did you learn?
The first piece of the confidence that I gained, like any other skill, is practice.
Mm-hmm.
So having gone through situations that are really bad, people really upset with one another. I worked in a pretty polarized environment at a large organization, and there were unionized and non-unionized employees, and there was a ton of conflict around that.
Yeah.
And I was in administration, which felt really uncomfortable and not totally aligned with my values at all moments. So it was navigating these situations where blame and grievances and all sorts of, not the actual grievance process. I wasn't in HR. But there was just a lot of conflict. And so how do you facilitate conflict? Some of the tips I picked up or tools were around setting ground rules, which happens in those session zeros that I think are more popularized. Creating safety tools, I think, is something that is much more common than even when I started reading and playing even 2 years ago, but started getting into it maybe 5 or 10 years ago. It's hard to navigate conflict when we don't have a shared understanding of why we're here together or what our shared expectations are. And I've had experiences where, well, someone's bringing up this topic that's really, I feel, is inappropriate to this meeting. Well, we didn't talk about what's appropriate to this meeting. So now it's me bringing my own opinion in, and I'm just a person now. I'm not the facility. I think the other piece is that the group is responsible for the meeting. But also the group has elected you as the facilitator to be responsible. So there's this kind of back and forth in that groups allocate or relinquish control to individuals for the benefit of that group. But that can obviously be subverted by an individual then taking advantage of that or creating conflict. But the thing that I would do is someone brought up something really uncomfortable or harmful in a book discussion. I want to take a pause and let's wait on this. And what does the group think about what just happened? And someone will say, oh, well, I don't think we should talk about that here. I don't think we're ready to talk about that. How do other people feel about that? Okay, let's make an agreement that we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
Can everyone agree to that? And there might be a little bit of facilitation tone to some of the things I'm saying, but it's really unfair that the game master, warden, referee is solely responsible for the conduct of the players, the conflicts between players, the safety of players. That's something that was a default, I think. You're coming to my game. This is my table, for good and bad. And now I think it makes a lot more sense as we all understand that, well, I shouldn't say we all understand, but I have learned, and I think other people are learning, that we all have blind, and I was about to say blind spots, but gaps in our knowledge and experiences that can create harm. And so harm is constantly happening.
Yeah.
It's just, in what context does the harm happen? I think as someone in their 30s, I've learned that apologies really should be part of friendships. Even, I'll give an example. Coming out of COVID, we started board gaming in person again. And I was just so excited. There was so much conflict we had because we weren't used to being around each other. And so we were playing the board game Oath, which is heavily negotiation based. And I started pushing this other player to do this thing. And they just said, let me make my own decision. And I said, wow,
we got out of practice.
Yeah. And we said, why are we having these fights? And we talked about it a little, at least. And I said, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. And I should have let you make your own decision. And here's what I'm going to try to do in the future or something like that. And, but that's a really good practice to bring into, and I think the other thing is psychological safety. It's like thinking about what your table can handle and what you present. And so as a facilitator, I would really think about, what does this group, knowing what I know of the members, like what are they emotionally or mentally equipped to handle in terms of like the other contexts of the situation, what's going on in their lives.
Yeah.
In this case, like, were there managers there or other administrators there? Like, did I expect those people to start to get into defensive mode, which would become radioactive to the people who feel like they were harmed and all this kind of stuff? But with your table, what can the group handle? What types of play could they experience? Sexual content in particular is something that I feel like most tables I've encountered can't safely engage with, at least in a descriptive way. I mean, maybe there's lines and veils. Maybe there's veils that we can create that explore that. But I've generally taken that off the table because I don't feel like I have enough time or a long enough campaign or group or group of people. And
to your point, it's not why you're there, right? Yeah, but for other players and other games, that is why they're there. I mean, there is a thriving community that engages in these games to explore those exact things. You go back to Apocalypse World when Vincent McGay first introduced the sex move. Yeah. And like the reverberations of that are still being felt today. I mean, it literally spun a whole new form of gaming into orbit. Yeah. And it also caused a considerable number of people to bounce right directly off of it. And others, haven't been able to negotiate it. It's very, very interesting. And I'm going to just reiterate one point that you made, which is, well, obviously the session zero is critical, right? Why are we here? What are our goals? And the other thing that you hinted at that I want to emphasize is the check-ins. Like at the end of every session. And I use a form of something that I picked up from the Gauntlet, which was, the stars and wishes. And
interesting.
Yeah. So at the end of every session, and what it is if you at the end of the session go, what did you like? What didn't you like? You're not going to, it's hard for people to answer those questions. And I thought the phrasing of stars and wishes or the framing
I haven't heard
of
that
stars
one
and
before.
wishes is great. So stars, you say, what was your star moment? Either a character moment when you were fully into this, like when you look back at the last 2 hours, what were the star moments for you? It gives players the opportunity to complement each other, which is always great and creates a bond. It gives them freedom to compliment you as the game runner, which is always nice, but it's incredibly informative, right? Because what they're really telling you is what are they digging right now? What are they loving? Which is gold. If you're the type of game runner that wants to do more of that, right? And wants to facilitate that. But the killer one is the wishes, which is, I don't want to know what your character's wishing for. What are you wishing for as the player? And you start getting answers like, well, I want to find out more about like this witch. Like, why is she turning goblins into pigs? Or, we came across, this guy at the tavern 4 days ago who had an arm growing out of his back. And, we didn't get a chance to really
talk to them. Yeah.
Right. We never really talked to him. And I really kind of wish as a player that we had, or that I could understand that more, or I wish we could do a little bit more first person role playing, right? Sometimes it's, more of a meta type discussion. But what I have learned, and, the first time you do it with new people, they struggle with it, but people get into the groove. And when it's a regular thing, they know it's coming, which means they start thinking about it before the conversation happens. You're not ambushing them and everything. It ends up being incredibly powerful for the whole table, because even though it's initiated by the game runner, you end up in being, the players are informing each other too. Right. And they're praising good behavior that they want to see more from the other players. You're able to find wishes that can be fulfilled from player to player as well as GM. So it's a really interesting idea that the first time I came across it, I was a little dismissive and thought it was me. But now having practiced it and now I'm completely in love with it, I can't imagine not doing it.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that before, but I'm really eager to try it. And it's reminding me of just this idea that's been rolling around in my head recently as a writer, but also as a player and human being, is just that, I don't know if it's like all communication, but authentic communication is really an act of vulnerability. Yeah. That in order to communicate, I must reveal myself and I must open myself to receive information. There's certainly like guarded or armored communication that I'm going to come through the situation without you knowing who I am or without putting things at risk. But role playing and improv, which it is really fundamentally based on risk. And I think that's the same with play. And I think the only way that I'm able to take that armor down is when I feel some level of psychological safety. Yeah. And that what you're talking about, I think is I would imagine even knowing as a player that we can talk about stuff like that. I think one of the other challenges I'm having, I don't see anyone use the X card. Yeah. So I think that's something that might happen more in campaign settings, but I think there's a real stigma around using something like an X card. I think certainly there are with strangers and I'm sure it happens, but how can I get more people to use the X card or slow things down is something I'm exploring as a ward. And I was doing some sessions recently and I was saying, am I describing this too gory? Is this like let me know to pull back if any of these descriptions. So even checking in as stuff's happening, doing a content warning or talking about what might happen ahead of time, and then checking in along the way is just something I've been exploring, because I feel like it can be pretty embarrassing to hit that X on the table or say X or type it in or something like that. That can be a barrier for folks.
Yeah, I think, again, being an old dude, the X card and safety tools are new to me, as they were new to the hobby. And I have noticed exactly what you're saying, which is like, I've never had the X card played in any of my actual plays. And I'm now well over 50 different players that have played in various ways on the channel. We have an X card on the channel. It's a phrase that any player can say that is not that everybody that is, part of the group knows what that phrase is. But if you're watching, you would never know. Right. Because that was critical. So I didn't want people to think it even more. Yeah. Correct. Right. But it's still, you still have that anxiety of doing it to just the 5 people that you're playing with. Right. And that is a real thing. And I was concerned that after, 3 years of doing this, I've yet to have that phrase mentioned on my channel. I'm like, am I doing it wrong? Is it too hard to it? And I talked to some of the regular players that I've had. And one insight that I thought was interesting is like, Craig, I've never needed to, because of the level of communication we have. You are very good at facilitating a table that doesn't want to push things in those directions, because we know what those things are, right? It truly is a break glass thing, which is, I didn't know your dog died yesterday, and now I'm talking about, a dog dying in gameplay. I realized that that's kind of, for me, what the X card really is. Versus a edgelord, I want to push the barriers and push you to say stop, right? So that's one thing I'll throw at you as you start working through it.
And I still use it in particular because I do think, like you're saying, there's a real psychological benefit to knowing that I can stop things. Yeah. And knowing what will happen if I ask for that. So I think you're right. I mean, in some ways it's a sign of success if you're not using it, but it's something I just, recently been thinking about. But that's great that really interesting to hear your experiences on that.
Yeah. And the second piece of that's real critical in my mind, which is you have to be very explicit about what happens after it's invoked. Because if you don't do that, then people like, what happened? Okay, I know why I would play the X card or touch the X, but then what happens? And if you're not very explicit about what happens afterwards, then that creates a new barrier, right? So back to the phrase on the channel. If someone says this phrase, I say, okay, if someone says this is what we're going to do. That person's going to step away. We are stopping play. I will facilitate us in a very natural way, rewinding. We'll go back. We'll know what happened. We may not know exactly what happened, but we'll have a strong sense of what to avoid. And we're going to move forward again, and we're going to dodge that. And we're going to move off of that. And then when they get back, we're going to be ready to go. And so now this is why you would do it. If you do it, this is what happens. I think that's important. And I don't hear that talked about enough, which is, being explicit about that. But for those of you listening, in the pre-recording, one of the conversations I always have with my guests is, how right turns on this podcast tend to be the best stuff. This is a great example. At no point did Watt and I go, let's really get into all this stuff. But this is what I love doing on the podcast. So Watt, I appreciate you being patient with it. Let's get back over though. I want to talk about the first time you came across Mothership, because Mothership is the core of what you ended up making. And it sounds like in many ways, it's the core of a lot of the communities that you're a part of, including this mentorship. When did you first come across Mothership?
My first experience with Mothership, I think, was on the Ludology podcast. They were talking about, it's a board game design podcast started by Jeff Engelstein and since taken over by some other folks. And Jeff co-created it with somebody else that I'm forgetting the name of. I think Ryan, I'm forgetting the last name, but one of the hosts had talked about Mothership and the panic system and how there was this spiraling doom that was happening. And from the name Mothership, I really thought, oh, maybe aliens, astronauts with big helmets, cartoony maybe. I'm not exactly sure. And I sort of filed that away. And then probably saw some YouTube review somewhere of it and said, whoa, this artwork is pretty weird. There's an alien popping out, or I think the astronaut's name on the cover is Dave, which people talk about Dave a lot, but started to get into that. And it wasn't until I started reading Ian Usom's blog, who's the creator of Hull Breach and publisher of, I believe, Picket Line Tango and
great guy. He's been on the show.
This really nasty Doom one. I'm trying to think of what Meat Grinder.
Yeah, Meat Grinder. Yep.
Really some phenomenal work by Ian, who's got this really great sense of creating some unique stuff. Ian had wrote about this third-party Mothership Discord that he had created, and I was doing Troikazine and some other stuff, and really looking for inclusive spaces and finding other creators to talk about creating RPGs. I'm someone that likes to be part of communities, I would say. So I asked Ian to join, and it is not a totally open community, which is a benefit in my mind, at least. It's for people creating for Mothership. It's supposed to be inclusive. It's not, it's a small group. And so this is not to say like, sorry, you can't join. But it's just, if you are someone craving a community of other creators, think about bringing 2 to 3 people together that you really trust and you value their opinion. And the trust was extended to me, and I've extended the trust to the folks in this group. And it's become really foundational to pretty much everything I'm doing right now in the tabletop space. The group talks a lot about the business of RPGs. Ian's really open, and on Ian's blog, you can see how much he made per hour on, I think, different books, what the Kickstarter did, the fees that Ian paid, all these things. So the financial piece is interesting. And other folks, I know Jamie Stegmeyer at Stonemeyer Games did this for the board game industry in particular, and how many people, I still look at Jamie's blog for Kickstarter, and he doesn't Kickstart anymore, but I was pulling up some contracting resources that are on that blog for some of these art contracts I've been doing as a reference. And so it was this combination of this business, no nonsense stuff. There was not a lot of posturing, and it was folks really participating and making games. There's quite a few Mothership folks on there. So I don't even know if but just 2 of the people on the Cloud Empress project, Alfred Valley and Joel Hines, who have made some really incredible Mothership stuff, are both on this Discord. And that's how I got connected with them for the Cloud Empress pamphlets they're writing. So for me, one of the things I most look for in an RPG is the community around it. Mothership had a pretty inclusive community, and the other piece was the folks at Tuesday Night Games had done a lot to steward the community. Yeah, they have a pretty active hand and a pretty active Discord. They have done some fundraising for different. They did, I think, Dissident Whispers. That is a pretty political book around raising funds for getting people out of jail for protesting. Mm-hmm. So they make their intentions pretty clear. And even in the Mothership book, there is this, one of the key elements that most interested me in Mothership was the economic horror that certainly isn't original to Mothership, but it's prominent there and really takes its lineage from Alien, in that one of the worst pieces of the world of Alien and of Mothership is the economic necessity that I've got to go on the ship with an alien. There is no other option, because the corporation owns my ship, the corporation owns my time traveling, all these other things. So that was really interesting to me. And then the third party license is really great with Tuesday Night Games. So Tuesday Night Games will allow you to say your materials are compatible with Mothership, provided they are in fact compatible with Mothership, and that your content is not exclusionary or doesn't harm marginalized identities. And they specifically look at that. And that was something that's important to me because I've seen communities explode, implode. And my experience is it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Right.
And this, folks don't need to agree with my politics or anything like that. But when you're part of a community, like, what are their moderation guidelines? What does this community believe in? What does this community, we go back to those safety tools. What are the safety tools of the community? And we all get to pick different things. I know there's many Discords and places that have like politics section and anything goes section and all these kind of things. And I tend to steer away from those spaces pretty dramatically. But there was just this really healthy community vibe that I got, where people were respectful of each other, where inclusive voices were welcome, where me participating as a non-binary queer person wasn't the primary way that I was looked at. I mean, I certainly talked about that in my work, but it wasn't, well, why are you, my identity hasn't been questioned, which isn't the case everywhere. So I think the other piece was there's some centralization of the community. Something like Troika, which I've published under, is a lot more dispersed. I think there are probably groups of Troika folks together. I'm probably omitting some really big community I'm just not aware of, but I'm not aware of a big Troika community in one shared place. Correct me if you know of something like that, but certain open licenses, Into the Odds, another example, folks are publishing under there, but I don't see that connective tissue as a community. So for me, one of the biggest draws was this community, this really special community that Tuesday Night Games is fostering. The other big piece, right, is that it's doing phenomenally well financially.
Yep.
So it's got a healthy community and people are able to, it's not for me about making money as much as it is about like not going into debt.
Right.
And being artists and creators, diverse creators and editors and myself a little bit for some of the time that I put into my creative hobby and passion. So from that context, I've been thinking, well, what can I do within this context? And that's how I really have been developing my games most recently. I do have some projects I've been thinking about. Hey, this doesn't seem like it fit Mothership. Maybe in a couple of years, I'd put something out that would just be system agnostic or something like that. But a lot of my work is Mothership has created a context that's really interesting to me. And so I then think, well, what's missing from that picture?
Yeah.
What can I create that isn't like other Mothership stuff that I think the Mothership audience might be interested in?
And that's where we're headed, guys. So we're going to take a quick break. When we get back from this break, we're going to dive into the Cloud Empress world and what exactly is available right now on Kickstarter and how the hell Watt came up with this crazy idea. So the Insider Insight series allows me to sit down with designers, developers, artists, writers, and creators and learn how they approach their work. I try to understand their process, inspiration, and methods for crafting their creations. We've done that a little bit with Watt. We're going to do a lot more. We'll be right back.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Writer's Room, where you can find all sorts of adventures, antics, and escapades for the 7th Sea TTRPG. I'm Zoe Jackson.
I'm Evan Ackley.
And I am Patrick Keefe.
And we're here to tell you the stories of 7th Sea. If you enjoy actual play podcasts featuring adventure, drama, and swashbuckling heroism using music and dynamic sound effects, then you've come to the right place. Not only do we bring you stories from our 7th Sea gameplay, we also discuss the mechanics of the game in special episodes called Notes with the Narrator. To learn more, our Linktree link will be in the bio, and that will help you find us on your favorite podcatcher, as well as support us through our many different platforms. Won't you join us?
So we hinted at it, but let's be explicit here. Let's talk about how you describe Cloud Empress. So Cloud Empress is an ecological science fiction campaign setting for the Mothership sci-fi horror RPG. It places you in a world ruled by the patterns of giant psychic cicadas. Cloud Empress creates a new Earth, thousands of years in the future, inspired by Miyazaki's Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, Herbert's Dune, and Arakawa's Full Metal Alchemist. Cloud Empress imagines the far future. Find a way to thrive, live, and love in the psychic wreckage of Earth among the junk of ancient people who abandoned it. That is a lot. So before we talk about where it is now, let's rewind. If you were tasked with putting together the Watt Museum and we were building the Cloud Empress exhibition, what is the first thing we would have to go to? Where do you think the real seed of this started?
The seed of it was wanting a magic system in Mothership.
Oh.
And in combination with thinking about a World War II type aesthetic in Mothership, there had been not a ton in that vein at the time.
What's a World War II aesthetic mean?
I would say textiles, muddy textiles, bolt action, industrial. This technology level, I would say, is primarily, but some kind of Full Metal Alchemist has a bit of a I don't know, imperial certainly topic and theme to it, but it is sort of tanks and planes and some context around warfare, those kind of things. That was going to be a pretty big part of what I was thinking. It was this combination of I was studying the Russian Revolution, some of the different Russian revolutions on the Revolutions podcast, and thinking, how could I set...
God, that's a great podcast. And the whole thing that he did on the Russian Revolution was amazing. Oh, that's great.
I had a newborn in my arms. I was listening to all of those episodes and really thinking, okay, how can I put a magic system into the Russian Revolution, into the Mothership setting? So that was the start of it. The magic system for me is, I love magic. I mean, magic's so cool. That's the one, I guess. Even before that, though, I have friends, particularly queer and trans friends, but other friends as well, that want to play role-playing games. And they ask me, I want to play D&D. And I don't have much interest in playing D&D anymore for a couple of reasons. I'm not thrilled by the rule set. Whatever. And I also don't like traditional fantasy because of some of the defaults that players assume around traditional fantasy. And even that there is such a thing as traditional fantasy is kind of goofy, because let's imagine a magical world, and somehow we've come up with all of these tropes and conventions that need to be in that magical world of anything's possible. But players bring those assumptions and tropes with them oftentimes. And so it seems like it's talking at a tavern or starting your own tavern. I don't know why everyone wants to start a business in a lot of these games. But I wanted a game that would explore adventure in a way that I felt comfortable and would want to run for tables for years to come. And I also have been thinking about, and I'm going to get this wrong, but there are many cultures that have masks and character roles that are present in multiple different plays and sort of stories. So there's a series of Italian masks, I want to say, and I think Japanese as well, that there are these sort of specific roles that keep coming up in multiple different settings. And you sort of expect this one character to act the same way, even though it might be in a different context. And so I thought about this 4-person adventuring party. I can think of that pretty dismissively at times and unrealistic, but I started to think about it more as a sort of time-honored tradition and a mask that players could wear, and that these 4 character classes, or 5 or whatever, the character classes were in them of themselves a type of mask that we wear and a type of performance that we do. And so thinking about it more honestly and generously, maybe not more honestly, but more generously, at least from some of the challenges I have with the adventure genre itself. Continuing to work in that vein, I have a number of projects on my mind at any given time. I mean, I have some Post-it notes over here, things I think about. But as I mentioned earlier, the context of the community and where the industry is at, if there is such a thing as a single industry, but what are other people publishing? What is the financial aspects of publishing right now? And then where am I at and what resources can I bring to that? With Cloud Empress, the other spark that ignited it, I finished my last Kickstarter, Hot Stuff on Shore Leave, which is a single player Shore Leave module for Mothership that takes place on a vacation island. It's pretty weird. But I had finished or gotten close to finishing fulfillment on that. And I started seeing this artwork by this group called Catapulka. At the same time, the war in Ukraine started. I'm probably getting some of the timelines wrong there, but while I had been thinking about this idea that was heavily centered in the Russian Revolution, at least thematically, the war in Ukraine was starting, or I should say, the unlawful invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces. And so it felt less appropriate to focus my thematic elements on that. And so I started seeing this artwork that had this Nausicaa inspiration, and Nausicaa is a big draw for me as well. And so I started to think about moving the setting. It was always meant to be in the future somewhere with these same thematic elements, but maybe moving it even further into the future and incorporating more of the ecological messages I wanted to have into the setting. And that's where the cicadas came from.
Now, is that a scenario where, you have, and I'm going to use this, and I'm sure it's not this, I'm more oversimplifying for the sake of discussion. You've got all of these Post-it notes in front of you. Is it a situation where you go, the time is right for me to take this one, and this one, and I want to explore these more? Because I'm always fascinated. Creators talk about all the time, I've got all these ideas. And one of the biggest things I keep learning as I'm having these interviews is having ideas isn't that special. Everybody's got freaking ideas, right? What is special is being able to take those ideas and work them and finish them. And that's really the hard part, right? That's where the blood, sweat, and tears happens, not coming up with the ideas. So I'm fascinated, how did these elements come together? And you said, this is what I am going to spend time on.
And I think there's sort of a circle back that I would also add, in that ideas don't mean that much. They're not worth that much in and of themselves, like you were kind of sharing. But if you're going to put blood, sweat, and tears into an idea, the question becomes it better be a good idea.
Yeah.
For me, I was always sort of amazed, and we get different things different people get different things out of different things. But I would go to these board game design conventions where it's just for people to play test their board games. And they would be spending years and tens of thousands of dollars, literally, in some cases, mortgaging their house on a flipping tile game. I'm going to flip these tiles and they look like bees. And when you flip them, they land and you get points. And that is not my primary interest in engaging with games. It's not to create something. And being around creative people, I've seen how after something comes out and people stop talking about it, it just becomes a thing on your shelf. Or I have books under my bed. The making of something and getting it in your hands lasts a pretty short amount of time. And people don't really, sometimes you think, oh, this will be my legacy. My family's going to care so much about this. And they just put it in a garage sale, right? Yeah. I mean, it's not true always, but for me, the games I create, I really want to say something about the world or my beliefs, or explore complex and difficult ideas. And so that's sort of the first, is there anybody doing something like this? And second, is there anyone saying something like this? And third, is there anyone doing something, saying something, and doing it in the way that I would do it? And the more unique I can be on each three of those aspects, if they truly are unique aspects, I mean, those are the drives for me to do something. So I found an artist that was doing really unique visual work. I found an idea Magic and science fantasy and Mothership, there are one or two minor examples, but not on the scale that I'm thinking of in terms of creating a setting that would be a multi-book series. And then third, bringing in an ecological component. There is certainly some ecological horror, Bloom, and some other ones that really think about fungus and plants and stuff but primarily the horror aspect, not necessarily the ecosystem and environmental justice component. And the final thing, which I think is a huge gap in the market, when you think of Miyazaki-inspired, or when folks think about the term Miyazaki-inspired, my experience, especially in RPG Kickstarters, is that means cute.
Right.
It means Totoro. It means friendly monsters. It means all sorts of stuff that's really family friendly. And the most impactful work from Miyazaki for me was Princess Mononoke and Nausicaa.
Oh my God.
Princess Mononoke wrecked me when I watched it in high school. And my dad had warned me, oh, well, this is kind of adult and it's kind of disturbing. And what most wrecked me about that film was the sickness and illness present, and particularly the folks with leprosy. There was a community of folks with leprosy, and seeing the debilitating disease part of that's present in many of Miyazaki's works, this sort of debilitating long-term chronic illness. And I just hadn't seen that portrayed in any media in a way that was humanizing. And also one of the core foundations of Cloud Empress that I've sort of discovered through writing, not to go too deep into this, but I guess this is the podcast to do it. People think about themselves as an overgeneralization as discovery writers or outliners.
Okay. I haven't heard that distinction.
Or maybe like architects and gardeners or something like that. The idea of Brandon Sanderson, who I have mixed feelings on for a couple of different reasons, but Brandon Sanderson has given a really great gift to the community about these talks that he's done on YouTube. And he talks about two different writing styles, and one writing style being the outliner. So I'm going to outline every step of the story, and then I'm going to execute that outline. And the other type of writer is a discovery writer, where the outline doesn't seem to work and I need to write to understand what's going to happen. I believe Brandon Sanderson is an outliner.
The distinction I always hear is Clive Barker versus Stephen King, right? Clive Barker is the outliner, Stephen King is the gardener. Yeah.
I've read a lot of Stephen King. I certainly understand that. And then I've read some Clive Barker, but I don't know anything about his creative process. So, but me being a discovery writer, I think is sort of the piece about it, and thinking about.
And it connects to what we were just talking about, though, Watt, right? It about how
I forgot what we were talking about.
We're talking about the style of play, right? Is a discovery style of play versus an outline style of play. So for that to be your style of creating and writing is not a big surprise. It ties to the themes we talked about before the break.
And thinking about, I often use what I'm creating as a form of discovery for the ideas I want to talk about. And my wife will be like, kind of shocked sometimes at what I'm writing, but it's like, this is my place to talk about climate change in a way that, and I was talking about, Miyazaki and no easy answers. I'm trying to create a world that asks questions that maybe are more important than the answers, that creates situations where you have in Princess Mononoke, a human community and an animal community that are in conflict. Both are experiencing devastation, and there's no real answer for how that's solved. And I think that's kind of where we are, unfortunately, with, our climate crisis and the planet, is that human beings continue to want to live, and human suffering is very real. But we also know that the actions we take are harming the world around us and will harm us. And so what do we do with that? And that's one of the most interesting things for me about RPGs and creating a setting, is that I think there's been a lot of, having gone to film school through the 2010s, or in that time period, that was the like Walking Dead zombie period, and everything was a apocalyptic thing. It's funny to see Last of Us out now again, because that's so of its time period of, let's make it a post-apocalypse. But one of my biggest critiques now, having some time away from that media and having worked on some of that media, at least for other people, is most of that is people using the same worldview and the same outlook in a world with less resources or less power. And one thing I'm trying to do in Cloud Empress is imagine what would a different type of cultural society look like, and how would players maybe explore that? It's not a traditional post-apocalypse, and it doesn't think about apocalypse as a single moment, more as a transition, because many cultures have experienced apocalypse, and we stand, especially in America, on the ashes of those apocalypses. So those folks continue to survive and show their, particularly Indigenous Americans or Native people or First Peoples. I mean, the resilience of those communities, the survival and the culture that survives despite the apocalypse that they experience is remarkable, and so should be so honored. And so cultures survive apocalypse. It's horrible when it happens, and it's wrong. But what does survival look like in a world where disasters are going to be much more common, and are more common now than they ever have been?
And I promise that I want to talk in a little bit more detail about the magic system. So I'm not glossing over that. So for the listeners there, they're going, Jesus Christ, Craig, he's mentioned the magic system 7 times. Why don't you ask him about it? I do want to ask one more thing though, which is you being a discovery style in your creating, you coming into this and saying, I want to make some statements. I want to explore some themes, explore some ideas, and do that through the creation of Cloud Empress. Has there been anything, if you were to then flash back to the start of this process, now that we're towards the end of this process, what have you discovered? Is there thoughts or positions that you had before when you were starting Cloud Empress that the process of Cloud Empress has now impacted? Has it changed your thoughts about any of those things?
Like things I've discovered, or ways that the process has changed maybe by some of the process itself?
Yeah. What if you were to interview yourself from X number of months and years ago, and that Watt said, yeah, well, I think this and this about that, you'd go, yeah, you do now. But when you get done with this, you're going to think about it differently. Is there anything that's happened in this process of your discovery? I
would say, and we talked a little bit about this mentorship opportunity I've been given with Luke Gehring, but I would say the biggest change is I've been writing for, most of my life, more seriously for the last 20 years. And that when you hear people say that on podcasts and stuff, sometimes it can be really, I've heard people say, I've been playing RPGs for this amount of time, or I've been writing RPGs for the last 20 years. You go, oh my gosh. But that writing has not been through a singular media. It's my experiences. I think every experience we have can contribute to creativity that we're trying to express in the world, or self-expression and all those things. But I would say that I am learning to trust myself a little bit more. And one of the things I started at the project was I have some background in user design, user experience. And as part of that process, you take people's feedback very seriously, and then you make corrections based on it to design something that's great. And sometimes I did that with service design or physical spaces. And usually there aren't a lot of wrong answers with that, or people point at certain things and maybe they don't have the reason why they're upset about something, but you can dig into that and find it and maybe solve it. So when I was starting Cloud Empress, Twitter is full of people saying, I love it when you can read the text of a book out loud. Box text, I guess it's called. But I love it when you can read it out loud to your players and you don't even need to say anything. Or more books should have lore in them. like in character fiction, or more books should have this or that. And what I started to do was actually just take pictures of those and save those and have this sort of rolling list of all these suggestions. And my planned approach was, I'm going to put every single one of these suggestions in here. And then you know what? This Frankenstein is going to be the best game anyone's ever seen. The other thing, watching, I'll say I watch a lot of RPG flip throughs, and a lot of times people will go, there aren't tables on the front cover. I'm going to dock that some points. This text isn't bolded here, so it's hard to read. And that is their personal opinion on that. But some of those things can become gospel and dogma in terms of, well, they didn't bold anything. Oh, they didn't use the front cover. I'm planning on using the front cover because I can't for tables. But I really just, as someone newer to this space, felt very uncomfortable breaking any of those rules. But those rules are all very of their time right now. And obviously, you probably know from being in the hobby, and I've been reading some Traveler stuff, what we look at as an RPG now shares a lot of similarities, but the way books were laid out, the way that they were thought of, the types of experiences they provided, similar but pretty different too. Yeah. And so I think spending more time with the project, one of the things I wanted to include all of these, and I don't think they'll make it in. I haven't made a firm decision, but I wanted to include these like personal reflections that I had seen Jay Dragon do in, I think Sleepaway. I had seen in some other work, or I was like, how can I make this really innovative? How can I do something no one else is doing? And I'm going to include these personal essays in the book about my experiences in the Midwest and this kind of stuff. And I haven't seen anyone do that, especially in Mothership or the OSR and stuff. And the process has made me more comfortable doing things that serve Cloud Empress rather than serve a novelty factor or serve a community. That's a risk that I'm taking, in that people might be disappointed that things aren't easier to read in the book. At least things won't be bolded. I have some underlines for accessibility and just looking through things quickly, but I think I've let go of some of this pleasing everyone and really thought about, hey, these are the like 8 people I want to drill, and hey, this is how I think I can write, and it's going to look like this, and it's going to be, so those are some of the things I think that I probably couldn't. It's like a doing experience that you build that confidence, and the other piece is just the rule book will be free for the foreseeable future, even after the release. So I'm just sharing a lot of it with people already, so people can make a decision for themselves whether they dig in or not.
Well, and it sounds to me, and please correct me, it sounds like you're saying, you know what, I'm going to maintain my voice. I'm going to keep my voice, as opposed to try to create a Frankenstein monster that is, a collection of, Legoed feedback. And I think that's interesting.
And the whole voice thing is something I've really obsessed about in my 20s, writing some poetry and fiction and films and stuff, and really thinking how, I think the way you put it is nice, because it's like, what's my voice, not how is my voice different? Mm-hmm. I think the product design piece can be helpful for that. How do I design a product that's different? But the voice piece, if you're essentially inviting 2 to 8 other people in your head then while you're working. Oh, well, how am I different from Stephen King? And how am I different from Ursula Le Guin? And how am I different from this person?
Or Ian Newsom, right?
Yeah. How am I different from Luke Gehring? Like all this kind of stuff. I have stopped reading Luke's work while I'm in this mentorship because I don't want to. It's easy to pick up writers, really strong writers. Like anytime I read anything by Cormac McCarthy, all of a sudden I'm doing all sorts of weird stuff. So that's why it pays to read a lot, and also have projects be more than like a couple weeks of writing, because otherwise you might just be picking up this voice and dropping stuff and coming back to it's really great. And I'm having an editor on the project, which I've never had before, so I'm really excited to have an editor that can help me with that stuff and say, oh, you don't sound like yourself in this passage.
Where the hell did that come from? All right, so For those of you that stuck around long enough.
Magic.
So what you say I want magic at Mothership. And is that there is no magic that I've really seen in Mothership, or I want to do magic I've got thoughts on magic, and Mothership is going to be the way I express those thoughts. Does that make sense? Are you trying to fill a gap, or are you using Mothership as a way to say, I've got thoughts about how we can invoke and use magic at the table, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to explore that?
I think a little bit of A and B. My favorite thing about some of the OSR books is their really weird take on magical items. And that to me is the antidote to some of the play experiences I had with Pathfinder, where everything had a rule and things had to be balanced, and the players couldn't have too much power. It was going to wreck my sandcastle. And it's not uncommon in some of these indie books to have it. It's a mouth the size of a wheelbarrow that'll eat anything. What? Yeah, anything you put in it, it'll eat. Okay, like that's cool. That's fun. That creates humor. That creates all sorts of play experiences. And if you have the right table and you set the foundation for that, it leads to some really interesting experiences. And so that whimsy and the wonder and I don't know if there is such, obviously there's not well, I don't know. I don't have a lot of like actual magical experiences in my life. And that's not something I've experienced directly. So I guess that's a combination. The other thing though, so I was going to say, for magic to be strange and wondrous is kind of neat. And that's something that shows up in Miyazaki's work, is that it's like a fairy tale. It's dreamlike. It doesn't have a total logic to it. But the other thing I like, and from a gameplay standpoint, Brandon Sanderson is sort of notable. Again, I'm referencing a lot of Brandon Sanderson, but I've learned a lot from his writing series, was how valuable it can be to have a internal logic to any system you're developing, including magic. And that's where the Full Metal Alchemist inspiration really comes in. There are pretty specific rules in that universe to how magic works. And then, things can be broken when you can break those rules, but you need a piece of chalk to draw out a symbol. The symbol has to be on something. You need to learn how to make the symbol. The symbol can only change the atomic or molecules within that the system or the material, but it can't make new stuff and all this kind of stuff. So I had seen that also in Electric Bastion Land. It has one of the, I think, just great ways of doing magic, which is it has these things called oddities, which are typically single-use items that just do something really unbalanced. Which someone said Cloud Empress reminds me a little bit of Morrowind, because Morrowind had some of these things where you just leap 80 feet in the air and you're like, this is breaking the game, but it's a lot of fun. And I just dig that kind of stuff. So the magic is a combination of, I think, three things. The first being strangeness and wonder and weirdness. The second being a system that creates limitations for that, in that there is a physical resource called chalk, right? Full Metal Alchemist there, but the chalk is collected from the outer shells, the moltings of the giant cicadas. So the cicadas have this psychic component to them, and there's a resource that can be gathered from their shells. Again, a la Dune, pretty on the nose with some of my references there, but they're cicadas. And that is a sort of Midwest Americana or American thing that's important to me as well with the cicada piece. But so there's a resource there, so people can't be casting these spells like every 2 minutes. And then the third piece is really interrogating power fantasies, which we've talked about a little bit already. But each spell comes with a consequence. So if you're going to throw your voice, this is a spell in Cloud Empress. If you're going to throw your voice across the room, well, the consequence for that is that you don't have a voice for the next 5 hours. Your voice has actually left your body and you can no longer talk for 5 hours. There is one of my favorite spells in Animate Vegetables. So you can bring up to 3 vegetables to life that sort of waddle around and do different stuff. They're not fully sentient. They're not fully mindless. But for the next like 5 weeks or month, you won't willingly eat vegetables.
Right.
So like, what would the embodied experience of animating a vegetable be like? And what would the consequence of that be? One of the games that my friends and I would play in high school is thinking about superpowers really, really seriously. And we would think about things like time travel. And we would say, that would probably drive the average person into a severe state of mental illness, because you could change anything or stopping time. Well, you would probably, unless you really control your urge to stop time, have some significant mental challenges to being alive for 8 times as long as someone else. I mean, vampire media is so about that. What would this all mean? One of my other favorite consequences is if you become quite large, you can grow your size to 2 to 10 times as big, depending on how much of this resource you ingest. That's great, but you need to eat the amount of food that large body would take. So you will die. You will starve to death if you do not eat like a Paul Bunyan amount of pancakes after you become
Interesting.
large. So there's a humor to it, but there's also this body horror element of you've just made your body quite large, or you're flying. You turn your arms into wings and fly. Like all of a sudden, maybe your arms don't work for a period of time because they're tired.
Yeah.
There's a humor to that, but it also creates some unique gameplay experiences where, okay, I've cast this spell. I can't willingly go through doors now. So someone has to carry me through this doorway because I've messed up my body and mind a little bit. And so the other piece is really thinking about what is the cost of power.
Right.
The game investigates that in other areas, and not just the magician class can use magic. Anybody can use magic if they have the right resources and they learn a little spell. But what would the consequence be for this amazing power? And everything has a consequence in my experience. And that's really to some of the ecological components and narrative pieces that I'm trying to explore.
I really dig that. And I have found myself really enjoying, because there's a couple games where I've explored this in, and this gets me excited about Cloud Empress. I really find it interesting, the idea of, okay, there's magic in this world, right? And that has implications. And I really like the idea of it is very powerful. The consequences are also very powerful. And you have to be judicious as a result. And the quick example of that, going back to Forbidden Lands, if you have enough resources, you can cast a spell, right? There is no roll to be successful. If you cast a spell, you succeed, right? It just happens if you have X, Y, and Z. But depending on how powerful the spell is, there's a chance that you can have a mishap. And if you roll on 2d6, a 6 and a 6 in the mishap, you're dead and you kill everybody else. So that means every single time I cast a spell, I could kill everybody. And I remember reading that for the first time going, okay, that's interesting.
That's amazing.
But what's really interesting about it for me, was watching the magic user in the game and the impact that has on them. And really, especially when the player who's playing that character stopped being the player and started being the character. And the character, realizing, being naive and reckless and then the consequences of that. I mean, it has created some really fascinating character studies. I can
imagine some really interesting narrative arcs then too, in terms of, does this character continue to act this way? And what does the people around them think?
Exactly. And watching the other players with their characters, watching this journey that's now never written in the book anywhere, right? Like, this isn't like, this is what your magic users like. This is something that the player has found in this character. And this character is now going through this incredible arc that was nowhere, that was not brought by me and really wasn't even brought by the player, but the mechanics kind of put all the seeds there. So I'm super excited with a similar idea being brought into your world. That's really interesting.
I should say mechanically, I think where it's at, some of these rules changes happen weekly, but where it's at now is I've changed the stats slightly for a couple different reasons, but it's a heart stat. So you test under heart. In the typical D100, you roll 2d 10 and you try to get under your stat level. The spell in essence is a success automatically, but if you fail, you roll on that miscast table that's usually quite a bit of fun in terms of it targets someone else, it fizzles, it increases the effect by twofold or decreases the effect. So similar kind of system. The other thing that really hooks people and took quite a bit of time to write, even though it was just a single line, is in the class selection or job selection, it says there are no old magicians.
Oh, that's so good.
And so there is this
on
the character sheet and it's a rule. I mean, people can break you could break the rule. I'm not
sure.
But there are no old magicians. And so people go, well, why are there no old magicians? And then you start to find out about the magic system and you start to say, oh, okay, well, that's a question we'll have to answer. And
yeah.
And maybe there are old magicians. I don't know. Maybe there aren't. That's when we talked about the sun has exploded. There are no old magicians. Okay.
Yep.
Like, where are we going with this?
Yeah. If you, the one little tidbit I'll give you is if you've not looked at DCC, Dungeon Crawl Classics.
I just had someone say, why didn't you use DCC for this rule set? So I haven't looked at that too much.
Yeah,
so
go check it out. The way they handle magic is really interesting. And it's not exactly what you're talking about, but there's echoes there. And I think it's one of those things where if you saw what they were doing, I'm not saying you're going to like it or not like it. I think it would be interesting to you.
Cool.
Yeah. So check it out. And it's extremely unique. It's unlike other things in DCC, which are just born of, white box D&D. This is not born of white box. Okay. This is truly different and innovative. And I have never seen anything quite like it. All right. Last question about this. And we're going to get into one more thing. I want to know, when do you know you're done? When do you go, this is going to the printer?
These are great creative questions. I have been thinking about this phrase, never finished, only abandoned.
Right.
There's other variations on that.
Mm-hmm.
Things are done when one stops working on them. And
I don't know if I like that. I want to keep going.
Well, I'll certainly explore that idea, but
when do you stop working, or what makes you stop working?
So I can answer that question. I think I could always work on something more. It's starting to realize the returns are diminishing, and it's also starting to think about what are my motivations for continuing to work on something. So I do believe, by definition, I could pick this up. I could pick any of my old games up and start working on them again. There are certain barriers to doing that. The files, do I have the files? Do I know what was going on there? Do I want to do it? But I can pick anything up and I can keep working on anything. And we talked a little bit. I mean, I had been working on this one board game for 3 to 4 years and got to a place where I had a world I liked, but it wasn't a game, and I had to put it down, and I haven't touched it since. I thought about it every once and again. Could I do anything better with it? But that was like a small T trauma to me creatively, because I had other experiences in theater and things where I did some writing, and in high school, I put an entire summer into writing this like one person comedy act that I was going to use for a theater thing at school. And I had to like audition to do it. And I spent all summer, I put all this time in it, and I didn't get it. They didn't want me to do it. And I was so protective of it. I didn't show it to anyone. And I showed it to a group of people once, and they were like, had some real feedback for me that I couldn't hear. And what I said was I wasted my summer, and I had this huge resentment at the teachers that had told me, you can't do it, or they didn't say you can't do it, but they picked other people for this thing.
Right.
And at my best, I realized things need to be worth doing while you're doing them.
Yeah.
So if I'm expecting a reward at the end of this, life is such that reward may not happen, and I may get the reward, and it might be different than what I expected. The second piece is I don't want to be working on stuff that people can't see. I don't want to work 3 to 4 years on a board game that may or may not come out. And so I've been really intentional about timelines, and I have some project management background in my professional life, and just saying, okay, one of the great things about indie tabletop role playing is We have Zine Month and Zine Quest every year. So Cloud Empress is up on Zine Month, Zine Quest. We have game jams every month. We have all sorts of things, different releases and stuff. And so I've really used those as game jams as a really good creative outlet where you have a month to make this. With Zine Month, I think it's probably safest to keep a project delivered in like 6 to 8 months after it launches on Kickstarter. So that's my time limit.
Right.
So I really think about the project from a timeline project management perspective, sort of my own producer. And there comes a point where I start cutting like really quickly or I need to cut a lot. Hot Stuff on Shore Leave, my previous book was like 100 pages and I just wasn't able to write it all. I didn't promise that in the Kickstarter, thankfully. So I did that cutting before I put it up as a product, which I think is really important and where a lot of crowdfunding goes wrong is when people have the dream, they put the dream up, which is Kickstarter's literal pitch to creatives is fund your dream. Well, I don't think you should fund your dream. I think you should fund your product because that's what people expect. They don't expect a dream, they expect a product, and they expect you to be a store. Yep. And I love my backers and I love my community for supporting me. But we have a shared understanding that they're going to get a product and they're going to get a product somewhat similar to what I promise. And that's fine, right? But we need to be clear. Again, that's our session zero is you're coming here, at least the way I pitch Cloud Empress on Kickstarter is like, you'll know what you get and you can look at it now and all that kind of stuff. So I think timeline is really important. I think the other piece, Mothership is impactful for me because, and RPGs in general is because I'll name a video game that maybe some your audience will be familiar with, probably not a lot, but I don't know. I shouldn't make that judgment. But two of my favorite games of the last 2 years are Monster Hunter Rise and Elden Ring.
Interesting.
Neither of them are very story. Well, Elden Ring has its own narrative story. Monster Hunter Rise is really a gameplay experience, but both of them are like the 8th or 10th entry in the series. And you can look at that really cynically. And I think there are some franchises where that's appropriate to look more cynically at it and say they're just doing the same thing every time. But I think from a product design place, from a user design place, iteration is really valuable and designing products in such a way that there is room to iterate. And Mothership, as I said, this really bothers some people. I think it's funny. Mothership is going to release its first edition this year, despite being out since 2015.
Yep.
And that was called its 0 edition. So my understanding is Sean and the folks at TKG have really been using that 5 years to figure out what the game is and is not, refine things, and then put something out that's a little different that'll be improved. And so I don't know how people will respond to this. I've been sharing it on the Kickstarter, but I'm planning like an omnibus or slipcover edition in 5 to 10 years for Cloud Empress. Yeah. So, I don't need to get everything right on this edition. I need to do my best. But I can only do what I can do, and I want to do it within this time frame. And using the time frame, and knowing that there are if I want to come back, creating those options for myself. Maybe that's the best way I can answer that.
That's very, very cool. All right. So the last thing I always like to talk to guests about, and we'll keep it brief because I've already kept you too long, is I'm fascinated by what creators consume. Now, we've talked about a lot of the inspirations you have, movies, books and things like that have inspired you. This is more what has hooked you recently. So is there any books, movies, music, stuff you've been binge watching you couldn't put down, a video game, something that just got its hooks in you recently?
So a couple things. Having gone to film school, I am very cynical about movies. Which I'm sure I will grow. My cynicism of role-playing games will grow in time. Maybe that you have that now. I really like Nope, the film. I think one thing I really look for in media now is uniqueness and strangeness rather than polish, which maybe is that's the first thing I sort of look for. And as I've been thinking about success. And Cloud Empress is very successful on Kickstarter right now. It's like, what are the costs of success? So that was really interesting. And and the fact that it's sort of self-referential is interesting to me. So that was a really impactful movie. Recently, Frontier Scum, which is an RPG that I've mentioned a couple times. It started as a Mörkburg hack. I think I'm saying that in the Swedish way, or I don't know if it's from Sweden. I think it is. Mörkburg. I think that's Mörkburg.
The more you sound like the Swedish chef, the closer you get.
It's a hack of that in a Western setting. To me, a lot of like Red Dead Redemption 2 inspirations. I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but some really, really good writing and a really great combat system that I've adapted for Cloud Empress. So they use guns in a really unique and dangerous way in the game, and I think almost in a way that speaks to like an anti-violent aesthetic in terms of how dangerous they are. So that's a game that I've really been interested in. Fantastic graphic design. Western anything does have its complications. I think it does make an intentional effort to distance itself from some of the ideas of the West, and it starts very intentionally, explicitly. The book starts that way, but I think a full investigation of that is probably needed for me. That'll take a lot longer and probably several years. Yeah. The new Wiseblood album, Wiseblood, that's pretty cool. That's another example of, I think, Wiseblood. I think it's pronounced. Some of these stuff I just read, but it's I don't know, like indie rock, indie pop kind of music, but they're a group that I think really does some pretty fantastic, I would say like political and ecological music in a way that isn't obnoxious. I think
or annoying.
With Cloud Empress, I mean, one of my intentions is that no easy answers. That means I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm not going to say this is go recycle. I think the best political media I consume, thinking of some Radiohead stuff and some other stuff, I mean, it evokes a feeling, it evokes an idea. Oftentimes those aren't fully specific. They more speak to a time period, a zeitgeist, a concept. That stuff really resonates with me. So that the new album has a song called, I think, Children of the Empire, which maybe the title's a little, gives you some idea what it is, but it's not like this straight on approach to, I don't like straight on approaches to a lot of topics. And so I really try to, anybody can read an essay, but it doesn't, I think most of our decisions are actually emotional as human beings, which presents some significant fears of mine in terms of how we're going to move forward as a species. But I think artwork at its best connects with our emotional and centers and can create some really unique experiences. So those are a couple. I'm rereading Dune for a book club, so that's been interesting to dive in. It's not my first reading, but that's been kind of fun too, I guess, fiction wise.
Very, very cool. Yeah. And something I think you hinted at that I just want to hammer out just a little bit is it's important that, yes, having this message, right? And Radiohead, I'm a huge Radiohead fan. The music also has to be good too, right? So if you're going to have a message in your game, it helps if the game doesn't suck, right? If you're going to have a message in your book, it's good if the book is a good book. The message alone is not enough. And sometimes we can encounter that situation where the message overtakes the quality. As a result, the message never comes through because this is shitty music.
And what messages do we really want and need? I mean,
right.
We get thousands and thousands of messages every day. Some of them very benign, some of them deeply troubling, some of them supportive. What have we heard before and what haven't we? And the other piece is just watching a little video on YouTube or something. It was like, we hear the advice best when it comes from our own voice.
Interesting.
And I've done some coaching work around not sports, but I guess asking thoughtful questions to folks to help them through different situations. And the worst thing you can hear is someone say, "You're right. You're right. You're right. You're right." And you think, oh, wow, if you're giving advice or something, you think that's the best. Oh, they agree with me. But 9 times out of 10, that person is shut off.
Right.
They say, "You're right." It's not I'm right and I agree with you. It's you're right. Like, get away from me. It's like, stop.
I want to stop talking about this right now.
I understand what you're saying. So if I'm going to create art, it's much more important for me to just pose these questions, create space for someone to say, what do I think about cicadas? What do I think about what humanity will be like in 2,000 years?
Yeah.
If we're still here, I don't know. What do I think about dreams? What do I think about the afterlife? All these kind of things that are kind of on the sub level of Cloud Empress, and just play around with that in a fun way. I mean, I think the other piece is people come to role-playing games, not everyone, but most of the hobby is around fun, wanting a certain type of enjoyable experience. That's where some of the laughter in the game comes from, and the humor attempts, is because I think humor and fun are really healing and really needed right now. So,
no, I completely agree. So there's two types of people listening to us right now, Watt. There is someone who foolishly listens to every episode as soon as it's released, which means that the Kickstarter is out there. They're going to do what I've already committed to doing after this, which is they're going to follow the links as they scroll down, and they're going to back this thing. There's also a group that is catching up. And the Kickstarter's over, and they're listening to this right now, and they're going, son of a gun. Damn it. I gotta, as soon as Craig puts out episodes, I need to listen to them. For those people that are just catching up now, where will they likely go to be able to take advantage and get their hands on this post Kickstarter?
cloudempress.com is provided I'm still paying the domain name. It's probably the easiest place to go.
Great.
If you don't find anything there, which you should, worldsbywatt.itch.io. That's my itch page, which is just a website where you can download my games. The rule book is really intended to be free and not just all the images cut out version. Like the full rule book with some nice pictures and stuff. Karen is a great, really inspiration on that. Just like give the rule book away, Mothership as well. So folks can grab the rule book, and then the idea is to have planning a retail release. All of the Mothership titles are carried by Tuesday Night Games, but also my past titles have been at Exalted Funerals, Spearwitch, and then some other folks, Igloo Tree, and other places across the world.
Beautiful, beautiful. And again, scroll down right now, guys and gals, you can see all of those links right below. There's a lot of things to do on a Sunday afternoon, except wasting a couple hours with me. So I really, really enjoyed this, and I appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been a great talk.
I'm glad. And you listening right now, this is the end. You made it through the whole thing, and I appreciate you too. Take care.
Enjoyed this episode. Subscribe to Tabletop Talk and share it with your friends. Check out our content on YouTube and Twitch. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and stay updated on everything coming from Third Floor. All the links are in the show notes. Take care, floorheads.
Oh, hey, are you still here? Wow. Well, the episode is over, but if you're bored, why not go to patreon.com and support the show for as little as $1 a month? Yeah, you can just scroll down and get the link. It's Patreon that makes this and all of our other content possible. Don't you want to join the other floorheads on the Patreon Discord? Anyway, thanks for sticking around. Take care. Bye.